because I think I remember using a textbook from one of the professors at Trinity. I can guess his name, but maybe I shouldn't use it here, but it was a book on historical theology, in which he took themes, the Lord's Supper or salvation, and looked at it historically. But it was, when I look back, it was proof texting.
It was proof texting. That's
Picking
right.
from Augustine, or maybe whatever father, that a text from their writings that was in line with the way we presently view, or at least see the trajectory of it.
That's right, definitely so. So, but I did very well in graduate school, and felt very confident about my future in theology, and I left and went to the University of Iowa, that has an outstanding department of religion, and began my PhD studies in historical theology. They would call it history of religious thought, but it was essentially historical theology. And I elected to focus on, once again, the Reformation, and particularly the thought and the writings of John Calvin. I grew up a Presbyterian, and Calvin was our man. And we liked Luther fine, but Calvin was the one who'd really gotten it right, and at least as we saw it. So I thought, there's no better preparation for my future career than to immerse myself in the writings of Calvin, and all the while to continue my scripture study. As I have occasion, study the fathers, particularly Augustine. Need to learn Luther very well. And I think I should probably dip my toe into some medieval Catholic theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and then some American theologians that were important evangelicals like Jonathan Edwards. So I really wanted to prepare my pedigree to be the perfect Protestant theology professor, learn all these sources of the Protestant faith. And I was rudely awakened during that process. I studied everything that I was supposed to study, and the first hint that something wasn't right was when I really began to dive into Augustine of Hippo. He's a Catholic doctor of the Church, but he is the one church father to whom the Protestants point above all as this is the one guy who believed like we do. And I read thousands and thousands of pages of Augustine, and I took comprehensive exams in Augustine, and I learned Augustine, and I came to the shocking discovery that, lo and behold, Augustine was a Catholic. And when I looked at his views of salvation and justification, they were Catholic. I put them side to side with the Council of Trent. They were Catholic. I put them side to side with the writings of Thomas Aquinas. They were Catholic. And I realized that the unique Protestant accents that Luther put on justification and salvation, particularly faith alone, were utterly absent in the mind of St. Augustine, utterly absent. And in fact, his views were anathematized, rejected by the Reformers, not by name. They didn't reject Augustine, but his views. So this bothered me, and I began to look deeper into, well, if it's not Augustine, maybe there's somebody earlier. Maybe Augustine lost it, but someone else had it correct.
I was wondering, because the assumption behind so many Protestant faiths is that the early church was all right.
That's
but
right.
At some point in time it encountered a fork in the road and took the wrong fork. All right. And some push it all the way to Leo the Great, which would have been after Augustine.
Right.
So you could push, well, Augustine had some good things, but he had all that burden on his back. And so were you thinking that? Were you looking for, was there an earlier time or a later time?
I can remember specifically the day I figured out that Augustine was a Catholic and that he really, really did not hold to Luther's views. Rushing in and finding a Lutheran friend of mine and saying, where do I go now? What father should I read? And he didn't have an answer. But I began to look and went back to the 3rd century, the 2nd century, and it was even more terrifying because the earlier I went, the less like Protestants they looked. And the doctrine of the 2nd century church was even farther removed from Luther. So then I thought, well, maybe I need to re-examine the writings of St. Paul. So I'm going to go back to my Greek text. I'm going to go back to the Bible. I'm going to look at Scripture itself and see, can I find Luther in the writings of St. Paul? And I thought, I'm going to go to the authorities. I'm going to get all the helps I can. I'm going to look at the Greek text, but I'm going to look at Protestant biblical scholars. I'm not going to look at any Catholics. I really want to convince myself of the truth of the Lutheran position on Scripture. So I go find Protestant biblical scholars, and I happen across this movement called the New Perspectives on Paul, which is a movement in Protestant biblical scholarship that attempts to interpret Paul in light of his Jewish context in the first century. And these are the first-class biblical scholars, all of them Protestants, all of them with a Protestant view of the Bible as the sole rule of faith. And I come to find out that the best in Protestant scholarship in the 20th century rejects Luther. And they're not Catholics. Their point of view on Paul is not entirely Catholic, but they provided me with a framework for seeing that Paul also could not really truthfully and honestly be read from a Lutheran point of view. Luther misunderstood Paul. And so from the sources of the faith, from the fathers of the church, and from the best in Protestant scholarship, I eventually came to the position that justification by faith alone was a 16th century invention by a Saxon monk who had left the church and was no part of historic Christianity. And yet, I still didn't consider becoming Catholic, but my faith was shaken.
Can I ask,